The phone rang, cutting through the humid air of the police barracks like a siren. It was a sound that every officer in Colombia had learned to fear. On the other end of the line was a voice that controlled 80% of the world's cocaine trade, a voice that commanded armies, bought governments, and paralyzed a nation with terror. The offer was simple, yet terrifyingly specific: $6 million in cash to look the other way, or a death sentence for his entire family. The voice on the line promised not just to kill his wife and children, but to dig up his ancestors from their graves and shoot their bones. In the early 1990s, saying no to the Medellín Cartel was usually the last thing a man ever did. The country was on its knees, held hostage by car bombs and public assassinations. But the man holding the receiver was not like the others. He didn't tremble. He didn't negotiate. He simply hung up the phone and prepared for war. This is the true story of Colonel Hugo Martínez, the unbribable soldier who hunted down Pablo Escobar, proving that while silver can buy silence, it cannot buy a man's soul. How much is your integrity worth when the gun is pointed at your son's head? To understand the war that nearly destroyed a nation, you first have to look at the soil from which the violence grew. In the dusty streets of Rio Negro, long before the world knew his name, Pablo Escobar was already plotting his ascension. He was a child of the La Violencia era, a time in Colombian history written in blood. While other children played soccer, young Pablo was absorbing a different lesson: in a world without rules, the man who strikes first becomes the law. He didn't start as the king of cocaine. His empire began with petty theft, stealing tombstones from graveyards to sandblast and resell, and later, hijacking cars. But his ambition was never small. He once told his friends, with a terrifying seriousness in his eyes, that if he wasn't a millionaire by 22, he would kill himself. By the mid-1970s, the world was changing. The demand for marijuana was fading, replaced by a white powder that promised higher highs and even higher profit margins. Pablo Escobar saw an opportunity that would make the gold rush look like pocket change. He realized that the real power wasn't in the street hustle, it was in the logistics. He united the disparate smugglers of Antioquia into a single, terrifyingly efficient organization, the Medellín Cartel. They didn't just smuggle drugs, they industrialized the process. They bought islands in the Bahamas for refueling, they hired top-tier pilots, and they bribed anyone who stood in their way. Money began to flow into Medellín not in stacks, but in truckloads. It was so much cash that they spent thousands of dollars a month just on rubber bands to hold the bills together. While Pablo Escobar was building a kingdom of excess, constructing his own private zoo at Hacienda Nápoles with hippos imported from Africa, a very different man was rising through the ranks of the national police. Colonel Hugo Martínez was the antithesis of the flamboyant drug lord. Born into a modest family, Martínez was a man of rigid discipline and quiet dignity. He didn't seek fame. He didn't want his face on the cover of magazines. He believed in the institution of the law, a belief that seemed almost naive in a country where judges wore masks to protect their identities and police officers were often on the cartel's payroll. Colonel Hugo Martínez was a strict constitutionalist. To him, the badge wasn't just a piece of metal, it was a sacred trust. While his peers were buying new cars with extra income provided by the traffickers, Martínez was checking his cadets' uniforms for lint. He was building a reputation as a hardliner, a man who couldn't be bought, charmed, or intimidated. In the eyes of the corrupt, he was a nuisance. In the eyes of the few honest men left, he was a beacon. But in the early days, the paths of the king of cocaine and the stoic colonel rarely crossed. The police were fighting a losing battle against street crime, while the Medellín Cartel was operating on a geopolitical level, essentially running a parallel state. The turning point came when the ambition of Pablo Escobar grew too large for the shadows. He wanted to be loved. He wanted political power. He built housing for the poor, earning the nickname Robin Hood, and even won a seat in Congress. But this exposure was his mistake. When the justice minister exposed Escobar's criminal past, the king of cocaine retaliated with assassination. The mask fell off. Their businessman was revealed as a terrorist. The Colombian government realized they weren't dealing with a gang, they were at war with a superpower. It was in this climate of escalating terror that the name Colonel Hugo Martínez began to circulate in the dark corridors of the cartel. Pablo Escobar had a simple philosophy for dealing with law enforcement: plata o plomo, silver or lead. You take the bribe, or you take the bullet. It had worked on generals, politicians, and judges. It was an irresistible offer in a country where a policeman's salary could barely feed a family. But when the cartel's emissaries reached out to Martínez, they hit a wall. He didn't just reject the money, he treated the offer as a personal insult. This refusal was an anomaly that Pablo Escobar couldn't understand. To a man who believed everything and everyone had a price, Colonel Hugo Martínez was a glitch in the matrix. The Medellín Cartel was used to fighting enemies they could see, rival gangs, corrupt officials they could manipulate. They weren't prepared for a man who operated on a completely different currency, honor. As the 80s drew to a close, the stage was set. The easy money days were over. The state was cornered, and in its desperation, it turned to the one man who had proven he wouldn't fold. The assignment was given, and the target was painted. Their hunter and their hunted were finally on the same board. By 1989, Colombia was no longer just a country struggling with crime, it was a nation descending into hell. Pablo Escobar had unleashed a strategy of terror that the world had rarely seen outside of open warfare. He declared total war on the state, the police, and anyone who dared to speak the word extradition. The streets of Medellín transformed from bustling avenues into kill zones. The king of cocaine placed a bounty on the head of every police officer in the city, roughly $2,000 for a dead cop. It was a sickening lottery where teenage hitmen, known as sicarios, hunted uniformed officers like game animals to buy new motorcycles or sneakers. In just 1 year, over 400 policemen were slaughtered. Their message was clear: no one is safe, and the law is dead. Amidst this bloodbath, the Colombian government played its final card. They authorized the creation of an elite, specially trained unit with a single objective: to hunt down Pablo Escobar and dismantle the Medellín Cartel. They called it the Search Bloc As. But forming the unit was one thing, finding a man willing to lead it was another. The job was widely considered a suicide mission. Generals looked away, commanders found excuses. But Colonel Hugo Martínez did not blink. He accepted the command, not for glory, but because he understood that if men like him stepped back, his country would cease to exist. Taking command of the Search Bloc meant stepping into a world of isolation. Colonel Hugo Martínez knew that the cartel's eyes were everywhere, in the taxi stands, in the phone companies, and, most dangerously, inside the police force itself. To ensure operational security, he sequestered his men in the Carlos Holguin Police Academy. They lived like monks, cut off from the outside world, sleeping on cots and eating in mess halls, trusting no one but each other. They were the Untouchables of Colombia. But outside their fortress, the king of cocaine was flexing his muscles, demonstrating a reach that seemed supernatural. The violence escalated to a level of madness that defied logic. A commercial airliner, Avianca Flight 203, was blown out of the sky, killing 107 people, simply because Pablo Escobar believed a presidential candidate was on board. He wasn't. The DAS building in Bogotá was leveled by a bus bomb, ripping through the heart of the intelligence agency. These weren't just crimes, they were acts of dominance. Escobar was telling the world that he was more powerful than the government. He was the judge, jury, and executioner. And at the top of his hit list was the stubborn colonel who refused to be bought. The psychological warfare between the two men became intensely personal. Pablo Escobar realized that money meant nothing to Colonel Hugo Martínez, so he targeted the one thing the colonel valued more than his honor: his family. The cartel intercepted police radios, a channel they monitored openly, and broadcast threats that chilled the blood of every officer listening. Escobar's voice, calm and menacing, would cut through the static, detailing exactly how he would torture the colonel's family. In one particularly grotesque exchange, the drug lord threatened to locate the graves of Martinez's ancestors, dig up their bones, and shoot them. It was a threat designed to violate the sanctity of the past, to show that his wrath extended even beyond death. For Colonel Hugo Martínez, the pressure was suffocating. Every time the phone rang, his heart stopped. Every car slowing down in front of his home was a potential car bomb. He made the heartbreaking decision to send his family into hiding, moving them from safe house to safe house, and eventually out of the country. He became a ghost in his own life, a father who couldn't see his children, a husband who couldn't hold his wife. His existence narrowed down to maps, wiretaps, and the grainy photos of the Medellín Cartel members pinned to the walls of the operations room. Despite the fear, the search bloc began to tighten the noose. They weren't just using brute force, they were using intelligence. Working in the shadows with American support, they began to map the cartel's communication network. They learned to track the faint signals of radio transmissions, a game of high-tech hide-and-seek in the dense urban jungle of Medellín. Colonel Hugo Martínez was methodical. He fired hundreds of police officers suspected of corruption, purifying the force around him. He drove his men to the breaking point, demanding perfection because a single mistake meant death. There were days of crushing failure. They would raid a safe house only to find warm coffee on the table, the king of cocaine having slipped away minutes before. The locals, many of whom worshipped Escobar for his philanthropy or feared his wrath, acted as an early warning system. Children would set off fireworks when the police trucks approached. Old women would block the roads. It seemed like the entire city was conspiring to protect the monster. But Martínez didn't break. He understood that this wasn't a sprint, it was a war of attrition. He had to be right only once, Pablo Escobar had to be lucky every single time. As the 90s dawned, the legend of the search bloc grew. They became the boogeymen to the drug traffickers. The invincibility of the Medellín cartel began to crack. Key lieutenants were captured or killed. The endless flow of money was disrupted. Pablo Escobar, once the man who walked freely in public squares, was forced underground, moving constantly, trusting fewer and fewer people. Their god of Medellín was bleeding. But a wounded animal is the most dangerous kind. As his empire shook, Escobar lashed out with even greater ferocity, kidnapping journalists and elites, using them as human shields to negotiate a surrender on his own terms. This period defined Colonel Hugo Martínez. He stood in the center of the storm, a stoic figure against a backdrop of explosions and funerals. He watched his friends die. He listened to the screams of a city in agony. Yet, he kept his compass true. He proved that the power of the king of cocaine was an illusion built on fear, and that fear could be overcome by a will of iron. The world watched in awe as one man, backed by a small group of loyal officers, stood toe-to-toe with the greatest criminal empire in history and refused to blink. The climax was approaching, but the darkness before the dawn would be blacker than anyone could imagine. If the story had ended in 1991, it would have been a tragedy of justice. Negotiating a surrender that was more of a coronation, Pablo Escobar walked into La Catedral, a prison he built himself, guarded by men he paid, overlooking the city he owned. To Colonel Hugo Martínez, this was not a victory, it was a mockery of every police officer who had bled on the streets of Medellín. Inside his fortress, the king of cocaine lived in luxury, hosting parties, murdering treacherous underlings, and running his empire via telephone. The government had blinked. The law had been humiliated. But hubris is a dangerous drug. When the government finally moved to transfer him to a real prison in July 1992, Escobar did what he did best, he vanished into the fog of the Andes. The escape of Pablo Escobar was a national embarrassment, but for Colonel Hugo Martínez, it was a call to duty that he could not refuse. He had tried to resign, exhausted by years of living in the crosshairs, but the president of Colombia personally asked him to return. The search bloc was reactivated, but this time, the stakes were apocalyptic. The hunter was back, but the prey was now desperate. The Medellín cartel was fracturing, bleeding from 1,000 cuts caused by rival cartels and a shadowy vigilante group known as Los Pepes, who were butchering Escobar's associates. The streets were running red with blood, and the colonel stood in the center of the chaos, tasked with bringing in the devil alive or dead. This phase of the manhunt was different. It wasn't about brute force anymore, it was a war of technology and patience. The United States, fearing the destabilization of the region, poured resources into the hunt. Delta Force operators and DEA agents worked alongside the search bloc, bringing with them Centra Spike, a highly classified signal intelligence unit. They were trying to find a needle in a haystack, but the needle was moving, and the haystack was the size of a city. The irony of this final chapter was poetic. Colonel Hugo Martínez, the man who had sent his family away to protect them, found his own bloodline at the center of the operation. His son, Lieutenant Hugo Martínez Jr., had joined the search bloc. The colonel had tried to dissuade him, fearing for his life, but the son was as stubborn as the father. Now, the younger Martínez was manning the electronic surveillance equipment, listening to the static, waiting for a ghost to speak. The father commanded the troops, the son hunted the voice. December 2, 1993. It was the day after Pablo Escobar's 44th birthday. The king of cocaine was holed up in a middle-class neighborhood called Los Olivos. He was agitated, sick, and careless. He made a call to his son, Juan Pablo. He knew the lines were tapped. He knew the search bloc was listening. But the love for his family, the very vulnerability he had tried to exploit in Martínez, became his own undoing. He stayed on the line too long. In the surveillance van, the signal spiked. Lieutenant Martínez Jr. watched the needles jump. The triangulation was locking in. "I have him," he shouted. The location was confirmed. It wasn't a bunker. It wasn't a fortress. It was a row house in a quiet suburb. The adrenaline surged through the veins of the search bloc. This was it. There would be no negotiations this time. Colonel Hugo Martínez gave the order. The trucks rolled out, engines roaring like the vengeance of a nation. When the police battered down the heavy oak door, chaos erupted. Pablo Escobar, the man who had ordered the deaths of thousands, was not surrounded by an army. He was alone with a single bodyguard. Panic took over. The world's greatest outlaw grabbed his pistols and scrambled out a back window onto the terracotta roof tiles. He was barefoot, wearing blue jeans and a shirt that couldn't hide his paunch. He looked less like a king and more like a cornered animal. The gunfire was deafening. Bullets chipped away at the roof tiles, sending shards of clay flying into the air. Pablo Escobar fired back, but he was exposed, running along the ridge of the roof, trapped between the sky and the guns of the search bloc below. A bullet struck his leg. Another hit his torso. He crumpled. The fatal shot, a bullet through the ear, ended the reign of the Medellín Cartel instantly. The man who had once burned $2 million just to keep his daughter warm now lay dead on a cold, hard roof, his blood draining into the gutter. Colonel Hugo Martínez arrived at the scene moments later. The air was thick with gunpowder and the shouts of "Viva Colombia" from the jubilant officers. He climbed to the roof and looked down at the body. There was no joy in his eyes, only a profound sense of exhaustion and relief. He radioed his superiors. The message was short, devoid of the theatrics that defined his enemy's life. "Vivamos," he said, a code word. The hunt was over. The image of Pablo Escobar dead, his shirt pulled up, surrounded by smiling police officers, was beamed around the world. It was the trophy shot of the century. But for Colonel Hugo Martínez, the victory wasn't in the photograph. It was in the silence that followed. The phone calls stopped. The threats ceased. He had looked into the abyss, and when the abyss blinked, he was still standing. The king of cocaine was dead, but the man who killed him had kept his soul intact. While the bullets were flying in Medellín, the war against Pablo Escobar was being fought on a second front, Washington, D.C. For the United States government, the Medellín Cartel was not just a criminal enterprise, it was a threat to national security. In the 1980s, cocaine had flooded American streets, from the boardrooms of Wall Street to the dance floors of Miami. The white powder was fueling a crime wave in U.S. cities, and billions of dollars were flowing south, destabilizing an entire region. The hunt for the king of cocaine became the centerpiece of the war on drugs. The involvement of the United States was deep, covert, and technologically decisive. While Colonel Hugo Martínez and the search bloc provided the courage and the manpower, the Americans provided the eyes and ears. Highly classified units, including the ISOs, Centra Spike, and Delta Force operators, were deployed to Colombia. They brought with them technology that looked like science fiction to the local police: airborne radio direction finding, satellite imagery, and voice analysis software. It was this American technology that ultimately pierced the veil of Escobar's secrecy, allowing the search bloc to intercept the fatal phone call. It was a rare and successful fusion of American tech and Colombian grit. However, looking back from the present day, the American perspective on this history is complicated by pop culture. For many in the United States, the story of Pablo Escobar is filtered through the lens of Hollywood. Series like Netflix's Narcos have turned the drug lord into a charismatic anti-hero, played by charming actors, living a life of thrill and excess. We watch the shows, we buy their Plata o Plomo t-shirts, and we often forget the reality. We forget that the real king of cocaine was not a charming rebel, he was a mass murderer who blew up airplanes and planted bombs in bookstores. This romanticization does a disservice to men like Colonel Hugo Martínez. In the TV shows, the police are often portrayed as faceless extras or corrupt obstacles. The reality was starkly different. Colonel Hugo Martínez was a man of immense moral stature, a figure who would fit perfectly into the pantheon of American law enforcement heroes like Eliot Ness. Yet, outside of history books and intelligence circles, his name is largely unknown in the US. We celebrate the villain because his excess fascinates us, but we overlook the hero because his virtue is quiet. The story also forces a difficult reflection for the American audience. The Medellín Cartel did not exist in a vacuum. It was built to service a market. The violence in Colombia was fueled by the appetite for cocaine in the United States. Every line snorted in a nightclub in Los Angeles or New York paid for a bullet that killed a police officer in Medellín. The supply chain of misery connected the glitz of American consumerism directly to the graves of Colombian heroes. From a tactical standpoint, the fall of Pablo Escobar was hailed as a massive victory for the DEA and U.S. foreign policy. It proved that the kingpin strategy, targeting the head of the snake, could work. But history has shown us the limitations of this approach. The death of Escobar didn't end the drug trade, it merely fragmented it. The Medellín Cartel was replaced by the Cali Cartel, and later by a swarm of smaller, more elusive organizations. The Hydra grew more heads. But this geopolitical reality does not diminish the personal victory of the search bloc. For the American observer, the true lesson of this saga isn't about drugs or policy, it's about character. In a world where we are often cynical about authority, where we assume that everyone has a price, the story of Colonel Hugo Martínez stands as a defiant counterargument. He showed the world, and the United States, that there are still men who cannot be bought. The legacy of this manhunt in the US is a mix of cautionary tale and inspiration. It serves as a reminder of the destructive power of unchecked greed, exemplified by Pablo Escobar. But more importantly, it offers a blueprint of integrity. When American law enforcement officers study this case today, they don't just study the triangulation tactics or the raid maneuvers. They study the man who led them. They study the refusal to compromise. In the end, the most American value found in this story didn't come from the US advisors, it came from a Colombian colonel who refused to sell his soul for $6 million after the body of Pablo Escobar was lowered into the ground, attended by thousands of mourners who still saw him as a saint. Colonel Hugo Martínez faced one final test. There was a bounty on the head of the king of cocaine, millions of dollars in reward money offered by the Colombian government and the US authorities. It was enough money to disappear, to live in luxury, to compensate for the years of terror his family had endured. But true to the code that defined his life, the colonel refused to take a single cent. He had done his job. He wasn't a mercenary, he was a policeman. He retired quietly, fading into the background of a country trying to heal. He didn't write best-selling books. He didn't star in movies. He simply went home. But his silence speaks louder than any explosion the Medellín Cartel ever set off. Today, while tourists flock to Medellín to take Pablo Escobar tours, and buy souvenirs bearing the drug lord's face, Colonel Hugo Martínez remains a ghost to the public eye. And perhaps, that is the way it should be. Fame is often the reward for the noisy, but peace is the reward for the righteous. The legacy of this story is not about the glamour of crime, it is about the cost of integrity. We live in a world that constantly tells us that everyone has a price. We are told that money is the ultimate scorecard. But the man who led the search bloc proved that there are things in this life that cannot be moneyized. Pablo Escobar died on a dirty rooftop, wearing ill-fitting jeans, alone and hunted, despite having billions buried in the ground. Colonel Hugo Martínez walked away with his head held high, his family alive, and his soul intact. So, the next time you watch a show about the drug wars, or see a t-shirt glorifying their boss, remember the other side of the coin. Remember the man who said no when the world expected him to say yes. History may be fascinated by the villains, but civilization is built on the shoulders of quiet heroes. What about you? If you were in the colonel's boots, facing a choice between $6 million and a war that could cost you everything, would you have the strength to hang up the phone? It's a question that's easy to answer in the comments, but hard to answer in real life. If this story of courage inspired you, or if you believe that honor is still worth fighting for, please share this video. Let's make sure the world remembers the name Colonel Hugo Martínez just as well as it remembers his enemy. And to anyone out there fighting a lonely battle for what is right, we see you.